50 years ago, people who looked like me lived in terror. And I don't mean the afraid type of terror, I mean terror like we ascribe to other countries, like Afghanistan and Iraq and Turkey and Syria. They were bombed and brutalized and murdered and lynched, often with the non-protection of law enforcement and sometimes even with the complicity of law enforcement. And we look back on those times, we look at images of those times, and we think to ourselves, how could we have let that happen? How could we let 4 little girls get bombed in a church and nothing happened? I never would have let that happen. How could we let a 15-year-old boy get so beaten beyond recognition and nothing happened? How could we have let that happen? I would never let that happen. I want you to pause and take a look around the room right now. Like, actually do it. It's not like a... And look who's here. In D.C., the nation's capital, all amazing people. Now I want you to look around again and see who's not here. In particular, people that look like me. We're in Chocolate City. I never want you to look at an empty chair the same way again, because these empty chairs could be filled with people that look like me. And if we ask ourselves, why aren't they here? I'm going to tell you that it's because they're physically incapacitated from being here, either because they're in jails and prisons or because they're in neighborhoods that they can't escape. And right now, we're doing the same thing that people 50 years ago were doing. Because this civil rights, this human rights crisis is happening on our watch. There are 2.3 million people locked up in jails and prisons. Despite the fact that we make up 5% of the world's population, we make up 25% of its incarcerated population. There's another 5 million people on probation or parole, one misstep away from being on top of that aggregate number. Despite making up only 11% of the national population, African Americans make up almost 50% of the prison population. 100% of the children in this world are locked up in the United States. 90% of the women who are locked up in this world are locked up in the United States. 75% of them are mothers, and 50% of them will have their parental rights terminated while they're locked up. 1 in 3 black men born today will spend some time in prison. 1 in 3 black women right now has a relative in prison. 14 million Americans have a criminal record, and there are 50,000 collateral consequences that impede their successful reentry back into society. There are more segregated schools now than there were on the evening of Brown versus Board of Education. There was more representation of Congress for people of color in the period of Reconstruction immediately following the Civil War than there is now. Indeed, there are more people under correctional control in this country right now than there were slaves on the eve of the Civil War. It's time for a new civil rights movement. This isn't news to anyone, especially those of us in marginalized communities. And yet nothing happens. Nothing is happening. We're waiting for someone, anyone, the next Martin, the next Malcolm, the next Rosa, to take us to the promised land. But we're waiting. And we're waiting. I'm tired of waiting. Because every day that we wait, more of us die. More of us go to prison. And more families and communities are destroyed. When I was 19 years old, I remember standing in front of a police officer, handing him thousands and thousands of dollars of cash that I had made over the course of that summer, and I remember handing him the little bits of weed that I had left over from the pounds that I had been trafficking from Philadelphia to Boston and back. I remember looking in this police officer's face and him looking back at me with this look of disdain and frustration and disgust because I had become a statistic. And I remember sitting there in that moment thinking to myself, man, I am in trouble. But in my 19-year-old mind, what trouble looked like to me went something like this. My parents are going to ground me. I'm going to get my cell phone taken away. They might take my truck because I was using it in my drug trade. And if college finds out, I might get moved out of my dorm to another dorm on campus. That was my idea of trouble. I had no idea what I was doing was a federal crime. I had some idea what I was doing was a state crime, but I had no idea that the penalty for what I was doing was a 10-year minimum mandatory sentence. And because of that 10-year minimum mandatory sentence, the likelihood that I pled out to that was about 100%. And by pleading out to that, the deprivation of lots of things that we take for granted would have started right away. I would have lost the access to public housing. I would have lost the access to financial aid. I would have lost the access to get a loan. I would have lost the access to get employment. I would have lost any professional licensure I had. I would have lost my driver's license. And because of the deprivation of all those protective factors, the likelihood that I re-enter the criminal justice system went up and up and up. And each time I touched the criminal justice system, I would commit more serious and more violent crime until finally I would end up in state prison. I didn't know any of that standing there. I didn't know how close I was to the edge of a rabbit hole that thousands and thousands and thousands of people that look just like me fall down every year. And if that police officer wanted to, he could have pushed me over, and down the rabbit hole I go. But he didn't, because I'm here. In fact, I did get grounded. I got to go back to college. I graduated from college. I went into the labor force. I worked there for 3 years. I came out of the labor force. I went to law school, stayed there for 3 years. I came out, I went to the DA's office. I had a wonderful career, highly decorated. I was able to do a TED Talk. In 2015, I met John Legend, and from there, everything changed. I worked with celebrities and artists and athletes and activists, everyone that you could think of. And last October, I got to sit with the 44th President of the United States of America and talk to him about criminal justice reform. And last Saturday, Oprah Winfrey said she was glad to finally meet me. No. Don't clap. The reason that I get to be here, the reason that all happened, because the police officer pulled me over in my driveway. The police officer that pulled me over was a white man. The police officer that pulled me over was my father. When I was 3 years old, I won the lottery. I was in an orphanage in a foreign country, and 2 working-class white people came down to that foreign country and picked me out of the litter. They raised me in a white-class town. I went to white working-class schools. I had white working-class friends. And in that moment, when my father put the handcuffs on me and brought me down to the station, taught me a lesson, and came home, he handed me a shield and a sword. That shield was white privilege. And that sword was the thing that I would go on to use in my career, to take it to protect anyone that tried to take away the privilege that I had, that I could give to other people. All of you sitting in this room have the opportunity, the power, and the privilege to do that. Whether you know it or not, you have shields and swords to protect those people that need it the most. I walked in the DA's office on my first day, and I started fighting against people who was trying to take the privilege that I would bestow on these young men away from them. Stanley, up there in the left-hand corner, robbed 2 people with a fake gun and was supposed to go to prison for 10 to 12 years. And when I asked Stanley why he robbed those men, he didn't tell me about the gangs that he was in. He didn't tell me about how he was trying to be the man. He told me that one day he came home and his mother was so tired, so sad that she was throwing up and she was crying, and Stanley never wanted to feel that again. What did Stanley want to do? He wanted to go to college. He wanted to graduate high school, something nobody in his family had ever done. He wanted to play baseball. He wanted to get looked at by the pros. He wanted to buy his mother a house and move her out the hood. I don't know if you can see that, but that's Stanley pitching in college. Pitcher of the week is a rookie. Stanley's now a sophomore. He's studying criminal justice. He got the honor roll last year for the first time, and Major League Scouts are already looking at him. Every other one of these young men were accused of crimes that should have landed them in state prison, but as a prosecutor, I had the opportunity with my shield and my sword to protect them from that rabbit hole. Every one of these young men, save two, are now employed or in college. This is what our criminal justice system can look like. In front of me, I see the new civil rights leaders of our time. Each and every one of you who has a shield and a sword, regardless of what you do. I don't need you to become prosecutors. I don't need you to become judges or cops. I just need you to do something different every day that's going to make mankind better. And here's how you're going to do it. I'm going to tell you the life trajectory of every single one of these young men and women. We know now that children in utero of a mother who's suffering from toxic stress, whether it be abuse or substances or environment or just poverty, their DNA is being reconfigured to inherit that toxic stress. That makes their brain smaller, that makes their development slower, and that makes them more likely to have problems in school, enter the child welfare system, entry into the juvenile justice system, entry into the criminal justice system, and end up in prison. Those are unborn children telling us, please do something before I go to jail. In Massachusetts, there are roughly 800 kids locked up in our Department of Youth Services. 75% of them had, on average, 3 interactions with the child welfare system before the age of 3. Let me say that again. 75% of the roughly 800 children that are in Massachusetts DYS right now had, on average, 3 interactions with the child welfare system for abuse, neglect, or malnutrition before the age of 3. Those are nonverbal children telling us, please do something, or I'm going to go to prison. By the time those children reach the first grade, they've been read to, on average, 18 hours. From the ages of 0 to 6, somebody took the time to sit down with them for 18 hours and read to them. That number in the communities that we come from is 2,400 hours. Put in a different way, the kids in my community hear 30 million less words than those from the suburbs. That gap in cognition, that gap in literacy, that gap in development has been shown to correlate to entry into the criminal justice system. Those are children telling us, if you don't read to me, I'm going to go to prison. Those children then go on to middle school. And not having the ability to learn to read, they certainly lack the ability to learn from reading. And instead of saying, excuse me, I'm having a hard time over here, nobody took care of me until now, our children don't have the capacity to do that, so what do? They act up. And what do we do as adults when they do that? We reinforce the same message they've been hearing since they were children, since they were in utero. We don't have time for you. We don't have the money for you. We don't have the resources for you. And we shame them. We punish them. We kick them out. And then those children reach a point called adolescence, and they're in high school, and they have the opportunity to leave school, and we're surprised when they do, even though we've been reinforcing that message every single day to them. Shame on you. And what do? They go out and find other children just like them. And meanwhile, when I was doing it in high school, or when you were doing it in high school, we called it a team, a club, a troop. But we've racialized this word. When young people of color do it outside the boundaries of school, we call it a gang. And what is a gang? It's a group of young men who love each other so much that they're willing to die for the other person. And they're willing to kill for the other person. You put a uniform on them, we call them soldiers and police. And when they finally do that one thing, that horrible thing, we say, shame on you. Now I have all the time, all the money, and all the resource to lock you up for the rest of your life. Every single day that you leave your house, you have the opportunity to do something, anything, for the benefit of mankind, whether it's volunteering or voting or visiting or taking care of a young mother, saying something to a young man that you see on the streets, donating to something, writing a check if you have to. Because 50 years from now, we're going to be looking back on this time the same way we look at 50 years ago. And like Dr. Martin Luther King says, in the future, it's not the words of our enemies remembered. It's the silence of our friends. So how do you want to be remembered in 50 years from now? As someone who heard this talk and did nothing? Or someone who said, I picked up my shield, I picked up my sword, I protected someone that had less than me? I was one of the new civil rights leaders of our time. Help me, join me, and if you pick the latter, I guarantee you will die wealthier than you can possibly imagine. Thank you very much.